Hey there, it's Jamie with a couple of videos to support you doing your next homework in week 2. I basically wanted to introduce you to 3 different types of charts in Tableau and get you set up for making them with an understanding of what you might be looking for when you are making them, the types of questions you could ask, and what they're good for. The link to the data that I use in this video is in the comments below the video. All right, I want to start off with tree maps. A tree map seems like a somewhat complicated type of chart, but there's a really good reason to use them. And that reason is that maps are useful when you're in the data exploration stage and you might not really even have a solidified question. So we talk a lot in this class about being specific with your questions, right? When you're going to answer a question with the data, the question needs to be specific. However, oftentimes before you have a specific question, you're in a what the hell is going on stage. You don't know what the variables are. You can't even really begin to imagine the relationships between them, and tree maps can help with that. They're useful because you can throw all of your variables into Tableau and see what Tableau comes up with. And then you can alter how those relationships look and things can make a little more sense. Let me show you an example. So this is an example on global emissions by country and year. They're not labeled. When we have it in Tableau, you can see, but I'm pretty okay with it not being labeled, and I'll explain why. So this is when I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I threw in all my variables into Tableau to see what it came up with, and it came up with this pattern. Interestingly enough, well, I think it's all interesting, but here's what I want you to see. I want you to see that there are large areas, and in each of those large areas, it is really made up of a bunch of small areas, small rectangles. Each of the larger rectangles represents a country, and each of the small rectangles within the larger rectangle represents a year. This large rectangle, as you might guess, since we're talking about carbon dioxide pollution, is the United States, and each smaller rectangle within it is a year on which there is data. So this upper left-hand corner rectangle is carbon dioxide emissions in the United States in 2019. Whereas if we go down here to the bottom, that small rectangle is carbon dioxide emissions in the United States in some much earlier year in the 20th century. So the overall size of the entire rectangle given to the United States tells us how much carbon dioxide pollution it has emitted over the time period studied. And because it's the largest rectangle, that tells us that it has emitted the most pollution over that same time period. If we look at the country below it, we see a different pattern. This is China. And with China, we can see that in the most recent years, these small rectangles are larger than the recent rectangles in the United States, indicating that recently China has surpassed the United States in carbon dioxide emissions. But we can also see that the entire size of the rectangle taken up by China is smaller, which means that overall, if we add it all together, they've actually emitted less CO2. So here we can see in this one chart both what countries are the largest polluters, and we can get a sense for how that pattern of pollution has varied over time. 2 things that take us both a bar chart and a line chart to show. So let's break that down and take a look at bar charts. Bar charts are kind of a data visualizer's bread and butter. When you put variables into Tableau, usually it will default by giving you a bar chart. And that's for good reason. Bar charts are really easy to make, they're easy to modify, but also they're really easy to understand. When you look at a bar chart, it doesn't take a lot of mental acrobatics to see relationships or patterns in the data. And also, Tableau has a lot of different features that allow you to filter and sort that data to make the relationships more meaningful. So a good type of question that I can answer with this is, well, what countries specifically are the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide in 2019? The tree map showed me that there's variation in emissions, but I'd like to get more specific. Here's the chart I made, and I'll show you how to make these in the next series of videos. So which countries emitted the most carbon dioxide last year? So our largest global emitters in 2019, China. producing over 10,000 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. At about half of that, at about 52 or 5,300 was the United States. Then again, about half of that is India, then Russia, Japan. And then you can see here that actually the emissions countries get quite a bit closer together and produce a lot less carbon dioxide. So we can see in this chart that there are a few global heavy hitters for greenhouse gas pollution, and those really are China, US, and India, with Russia coming in at a distant fourth. Another thing we like to know sometimes is how these things change over time. We saw it in the tree map that there were differences in the rates of growth between a lot of these countries, and a line chart really breaks that down. So the line chart, if you want to look at changes over time, the line chart is your tool. So if we try to answer the questions, how have carbon dioxide emissions changed over time, we would use a line chart. And that's the question that I have answered in this line chart. Global carbon dioxide emissions per year. How have global carbon dioxide emissions changed over time? Well, they've climbed. They've climbed a lot, from less than 5,000 tons of carbon dioxide produced globally per year in 1919 to over 35,000 tons last year. How they've changed, it's not just been a straight increase, right? There is almost an exponential growth pattern here. The rate of change has seemed to have accelerated. Up until World War II, we see a relatively flat slope, but after World War II, the pace of increase increased, and now carbon dioxide emissions is much, much higher. So if you think back to that tree map, we knew that there were different patterns for different countries. China was obviously increasing much faster than the United States. So the next question I sought to answer was, how have emissions changed over time in different parts of the world? Because we know they're not the same. So I looked at this by emissions by continent. And here we can see, this is our key. The countries that I'm most sort of interested in just discussing right off the bat, or the regions, are Europe, North America, and Asia. So between 1920 and maybe, the 1980s, the industrialized continents of Europe and North America were the biggest polluters. However, in about the 1980s, Asia, containing the powerhouses of India and China, surpassed North America and Europe to be the largest producer of greenhouse gases by a significant margin. Interestingly enough, Europe, beginning in the 1980s or 1990s, and the United States, beginning more recently after the Great Recession, have both experienced a decline in the production of greenhouse gas emissions. Other regions like Africa, Australia, and South America still maintain low levels of carbon dioxide emissions. So there is huge global variation in the amount of greenhouse gases that we produce. All right, those are the types of charts, some examples of how they're used and how we'd interpret them. And then if you come back in the next video, I will show you how I make them. See you in a minute.